In this lecture, we're going to review the files generated by the Create View package. We'll start with the root files. Then, we'll move on to the directories. The very first file is the git-ignore file. This file is for those who plan on using Git or GitHub. It'll instruct Git what files should be ignored when you push files into the repository. You don't want to upload every file in your project. The CLI has taken the opportunity to list files you shouldn't upload. Files that shouldn't be shared with others. If you plan on using Git for this course, then this file is beneficial to keep around. For this project, we won't be using Git. Feel free to delete or ignore this file. The following file is called index.html. If you were to look inside this file, it'll be the same HTML file from the vanilla JavaScript project with minor modifications. Overall, the index file serves as the entry point to our application. It's importing the script file from a directory called source. We'll look at this file in a moment. Up next, we have the package file. There are some interesting things going on in this file. Firstly, the dependencies object contains the Vue package. Previously, we installed Vue through a CDN. This time, we're going to work with a local copy. In the development dependencies object, we have an additional package called plugin Vue for Vite. Naturally, Vue does not work with Vite. Vite does not assume which front-end framework we're using. For this reason, we are installing an additional plugin for integrating Vue with Vite. Moving forward, we have the README file. The contents of the README file has information about how to run the project. Basic information to help you get up and running. There's even a link on how you can configure the project created for you. The topics covered in the documentation are things we'll go over as the course progresses. Lastly, we have the vite.config.js file. There are two noteworthy things about this file. Firstly, Vue is configured with the project by importing the Vue function. This function is called directly from the plugins array. Luckily, we don't need to dive into the inner mechanics of this plugin. All we need to know is that the plugin will help Vue understand Vue files. If we were to view the files inside the source directory, we'll find some files with the Vue extension. The Vue plugin will help Vite process these files. We'll explore what Vue files are later in this course. You may have noticed it already, but a configuration file for PostCSS is not present. It's one of the tools we discussed earlier. Despite that, the Vue plugin will configure PostCSS for us. It may not look like it, but our project CSS will be processed by PostCSS. Regardless, you may want to configure PostCSS. We are allowed to configure PostCSS by adding the PostCSS property to the package file. Vue will prioritize the settings in the package file over its own. Feel free to add it. For this project, the default configuration will work fine. The second noteworthy thing in this file is the resolve.alias property. You can think of an alias as a shortcut to a directory. Throughout this course, we're going to be importing dozens of files in nested directories. It can be tedious to write paths to files. To keep things simple, we can create an alias to a specific directory. In this configuration file, we're provided an alias called @. This alias points to the source directory. Here's an example. Let's say we had a file called example.js. There are two options for importing this file. Firstly, we can type the path to the file. Alternatively, we can replace the source directory with the character. Vite will handle replacing this character with the appropriate path. Keep in mind, the alias is only available with Vite. We can't use the alias outside of it. Using the alias is completely optional. That concludes the files in the root directory of our project. Up next, we have three directories. The Node Modules directory will contain the modules installed for this project. The public directory contains your static assets like images and HTML files. By default, the project will provide us with a favicon file. There's not much going on in this directory. Next up is the source directory, which is probably the most important directory. It will contain most of your application's logic, templates, state management, etc. We will be spending a majority of our time in this directory. Let's start with the main.js file. Inside this file, we're importing two things: the createApp function from the Vue package and an object called app. The createApp function is what will create the application as we've learned in previous sections. The Vue module can be found inside the Node Modules directory. The project is set up to automatically look for the Vue module. You don't have to worry about the path. The app module is a bit peculiar. We're not loading a plain JavaScript file. We're loading a Vue file. Vue files are considered components. They all end with the Vue extension. Upon inspecting the file, you will find a lot is going on. Before I break down what's going on, you may not have syntax highlighting for this file. If you're using Visual Studio Code, you can install a plugin called Volar. This plugin will enable syntax highlighting for Vue files. I recommend installing it if you have Visual Studio Code. If you're using a different editor, search for a plugin that will enable syntax highlighting. Let's break down what's inside a Vue file. Files that end with the Vue extension are called single file components. Single file components are made up of three blocks. There's the HTML, JavaScript, and CSS. The HTML is placed inside the template block, the JavaScript is placed inside the script block, and the CSS is placed inside the style block. All three blocks are compiled into a JavaScript object. This way, when we're importing the object in other files, it'll be usable because it's an object. The object exported will contain all three blocks. Let's examine what a single file component looks like after it's been compiled. Inside the command line, we'll run the command npm run dev and open the page in the browser. Next, I'm going to switch back to the app component and make a small change. I don't expect you to follow along, just watch. After making this change, I'll switch back to my browser with the developer tools opened. Inside the network panel, there will be a request that we can click on. This request will contain the changes made to the file. I'm going to copy everything inside this request and paste it into a random file. Alright, as you can see, I've stripped down what was returned by the request. I've removed most of the references to Vite. They're not needed to understand this example. This is the only part that matters to us. I know I went through a lot to get to this point, but this is the main thing I want you to focus on. Don't worry about the other stuff. This bit of code is what the template inside the app file gets compiled to. It gets turned into a render function. Inside the render function, there's a lot of confusing things going on. However, understand one thing. The value returned by the render function must be an object that represents the elements we want to render on the document. This function has been produced by Vite and the Vue plugin. The purpose of writing single file components is to make this process easier. If you had to pick between writing out your application between a render function and the single file component, then you may lean towards the single file. That's the basics of it and all you really need to know. We're going to continue using single file components as it makes our code readable and manageable. Let's go back to reviewing the files. Back inside the main script file, we're using the createApp function to initialize the app. We're passing in the app component to the createApp function. Vue will run the render function because that's what the single component file will be compiled to. The last thing going on here is the Vue application being mounted. The mount method is called to start this process. This wouldn't work without Vite. Thanks to Vite, creating components has been simplified. This has been a basic review of everything. Of course, there's way more to it, but we'll dive into other topics as the course progresses.